in the past 10 years, there's been a 2x increase in the number of discovered candidates. The number of approved drugs is kept constant at about 50. When a single drug development program can cost a few $100 million, that's really where our bottleneck is. We kind of asked the question, like, why hasn't there been a big pharma company created really since the 1980s? If there's like one competitive advantage you want to have as a pharma company, ironically, isn't in discovery, it's actually in this drug development kind of process. Instead of maybe being a 100,000 person company, a few hundred people building AI systems that do kind of all the knowledge work.
I'm excited, Ben, to have you here. Ben Liu, the CEO of Formation Bio. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So there's so much I want to talk to you about. I think probably let's start from the beginning, so to speak. What are you doing at Formation Bio? And why does Formation Bio need to exist? And I ask you this because I know you are obviously an incredibly experienced and thoughtful founder. And so I want to understand what it is that you're doing and how you arrived at the idea for the company.
Yeah, maybe it starts with kind of why we started the company. So, I trained as a computational biologist. So I think like many, really excited about how all the kind of genomic, proteomic, transcriptomic kind of data at scale mixed with AI and machine learning could transform drug discovery, I think like many. And during my graduate work, we're actually studying Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and we ended up discovering a few candidate drugs. And I think as an academic, you think like that is the bottleneck, right? Drug discovery. And I remember very naively, we went to a number of pharma execs with my supervisor or my PI at the time and said, hey, we discovered these drugs. Aren't you guys excited? And they kind of said something surprising. They said, sorry to burst your bubble, but we actually already have more good drugs discovered than we could afford to prosecute. And when a single drug development program, especially in neurodegeneration, like Alzheimer's, can cost a few $100 million across all the phases, that's really where our bottleneck is. And we kind of took a step back and we said, if we live in a world where drug discovery is only getting more efficient and no one truly knows what's going to work until you run a clinical trial, if there's like one competitive advantage you want to have as a pharma company, ironically, isn't in discovery, it's actually in this drug development kind of process. So
that's an interesting premise. So you are of the view that today, where we stand, there are a number of good drugs sitting on a shelf somewhere that just haven't been tested yet.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So if you look at the statistics, in the past 10 years, there's been a 2x increase in the number of discovered candidates. The number of approved drugs is kept constant at about 50 or so kind of drugs approved a year. And this is even kind of before, I think, AI is ushering even more drug candidates and kind of the rise of China. And I think the market actually reflects that. Like discovered drug candidates aren't worth much till post-clinical proof of concept, typically post-phase 2. And so we kind of thought like, well, if there are already more good discovered drugs, value inflection doesn't happen till post-phase 2. The capital requirements are the highest in this clinical trial process. Building a pharma company around first, the ability to run trials cheaper, faster, with tech, AI, all these kind of things. And ironically, we think LLMs apply to like medical writing, biostats, putting together a TPP. Like that's actually quite a useful use case for AI, but building it around this kind of capability.
So we got to define a TPP.
Yeah, a target product profile.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
and that basically is what the drug is going to do.
It is basically how do we help to serve an unmet need? So now that the GLP-1s exist, where's still the white space?
Okay, great. So let's pick at what Formation is doing specifically, how you're addressing this question, because you're absolutely right. If we sort of start from first principles, drug discovery and development is a long, expensive, and risky process. And to your point, a lot of the time, risk, and spend actually is in the clinical development stage, the human clinical trials.
Yeah.
And that is a very bottleneck space. And I love this sort of quantification of the bottleneck.
Yeah.
Roughly 50 drugs are approved by the FDA every year, and that number hasn't meaningfully deviated from that. It goes up and it goes down, but it hasn't sort of meaningfully deviated.
Maybe 40 to 60 is kind of the range.
It's like the equilibrium range for approvals. You think that Formation Bio should exist to address that bottleneck?
Yeah.
How?
Well, it's funny that you say the words should exist. We kind of have a view that you should work on things that you can answer affirmatively to this counterfactual formulation of impact. Like if this company didn't exist, would the world look any different? Our kind of view is in order to realize the productivity gains of AI, you need to be able to run trials cheaper and faster to enable more of those candidates to actually get to patients. And so, maybe kind of share what we do at Formation Bio. So as a company, we built all the technology, people, processes, AI systems to do clinical stage drug development more efficiently. We actually don't do any discovery. We look to acquire or license drugs, typically pre-phase 2. So 2 to 4 years away from a post-phase 2 readout. We're a hub and spoke model. So we kind of acquire drugs into a newco, and we provide all the capital and capabilities to get drugs to post-phase 2 value inflection. In the short term, the business model is to sell back to pharma. In the medium term, to kind of co-commercialize, a la maybe BioNTech to Pfizer or Regeneron to Sanofi. But at some point, kind of go end to end. But instead of maybe being a 100,000 person company, maybe like a Novartis or a Pfizer, a few hundred people building AI systems that do kind of all the knowledge work. We kind of asked the question, like, why hasn't there been a big pharma company created really since the 1980s, a la the Regenerons and, the Amgens and Vertexes and these kind of great companies? One of the challenges is that if you're a venture-backed company, you get a phase 2 readout, and typically that might be like 5, 6, 7 years into the founding moment, and you're venture-backed, and a big pharma company offers you $3 billion to sell the drug. Your alternative is not to sell, right? Run a phase 3, 40% chance it goes to zero, 60% chance maybe instead of selling for $3 billion, you can sell for $9 billion. Risk adjusted, you probably sell the company, right? And so one of the challenges is that because M&A in our markets is so vibrant, the future pharma company never gets created because you tend to sell. And so we're a hub and spoke because we can sell one of our newcos without selling the whole company.
Right.
And then we can recycle that capital. And at some point, when the cost of capital makes sense, dip your toe into the co-commercialize and
once you get to this sort of escape velocity, you can.
But you need to have an outlet, right?
Pharma.
Otherwise, how do you return capital back? Well, if the kind of criterion is to actually commercialize yourself, that is a really long journey. And so the short term is to sell after value inflection, medium term co-commercialize, at some point kind of go end to end. And that also means you need to take enough shots. So if you can only take 3 shots, again, statistically, if your hit rate is 30%, even if you hit one winner, you might not have enough shots to justify kind of not selling. So we kind of thought a lot about that. It's also important, we kind of asked the question, there's a couple of factors. You need a business model that allows it. So hub and spoke, sell a newco without selling the whole company. You need investors who want to go after the ride. So we're really grateful for folks like Andreessen that have this kind of real long-term time horizon. And you need founders that actually genuinely want to do it. So.
And you also need to be able to pick well.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about that, right? Because a central part of the premise for the company is that you are going to go out and find these potentially great drugs that are sitting on a shelf somewhere.
That's right.
And bring them in. So, find, pick, win. We talk a lot about that as our job is to find, pick, win investments. In your case, you got to find, pick, win the right molecule to develop. What makes you a better picker? There's a lot, there's a lot of smart people in our industry that have dedicated their lives to, developing drugs and knowing what a good drug candidate looks like versus one that maybe doesn't have as favorable a TPP.
Yeah.
Why do you win when the rest of the industry is also hunting for drugs?
Yeah, we kind of approach this with a lot of humility. I think our industry is full of perhaps some of the most smart kind of PhDs, MD PhDs, and really experienced folks across all the different relevant industries. And so we kind of first start with what stage of asset do we think there is a reason for why good drugs might not today have the ability to get to the next stage. And part of that is like we tell the team there's adverse selection, there's information asymmetry. No one's willingly looking to get rid of a great drug. And so the reason why we play at this like IND phase 1 kind of translational medicine kind of juncture is because this is where we think the markets are most dislocated today. You've had a number of amazing drug discovery companies being funded in 2020, 2021. They're finally reaching the clinic. And as we know, today's biotech markets are uniquely challenged. And you don't get too much credit for a platform. You get a lot of credit for an asset. So part of it is by stage. So the other stages we could have played is maybe in the post-phase 3. The post-phase 2, phase 3 readouts. There's obviously a lot of really smart funds doing that, Blackstone, Abernworth. We just think the adverse selection is a little bit higher there because pharma is not willing to give up a great phase 3 drug they would usually also want to buy a pretty good phase 3 ready drug. Because as you know, there's $300 billion of drugs going off patent. Pharma really wants to keep things that they otherwise have. Where we play, there's oftentimes not data yet to know, right? There isn't a clinical stage readout. And so number one, it starts with like where we play. The second is team, even though, and we'll talk about some of the AI things that we do, but we look to find the best human pickers. And we look for folks who uniquely are great at this strategy. One where we're not discovering drugs ourselves, but we're licensing from other companies. So our chief development officer was the chief medical officer of Allergan. As you know, Allergan like kind of pioneered this in-licensing first external innovation approach. Our chief business officer, David Steinberg, was a co-founder of PureTech. PureTech was a hub and spoke kind of model. But as you know, they kind of licensed this drug from Lilly into Karuna, and then Karuna sold for $14 billion. Chairing kind of our drug picking is Michael Dolston. Michael is the CSO, president of R&D at Pfizer. The reason why we picked Michael is his actual published phase 2 success rate was rolling 5-year average was around 53% versus an industry average of 30%. And we have folks like Frank D'Amelio, who did the Cerevel SpringWorks kind of deals, Dash Nadak, who is the CSO at Insight. And I think that kind of unique set of experiences are really important to us. The reason why the best-in-class human drug pickers are important for us is because they ultimately train our AI systems. And so, when we do kind of our diligence process, we actually have them articulate what they like about a drug, what they don't like about that drug. And that is kind of basically how we train the intuitions around how our AI weights each of the core factors, right? Clinical differentiation, scientific evidence, is there genetics, right? And that weighting, almost every human has a different way of kind of weighting that. There are other kind of things that we kind of think a lot about is we think about where there is maybe psychological arb. And by that, we define like, look, first in class, it's sometimes challenging for the industry.
To define first in class.
Yeah. So it's basically like, a target's like GLP-1. At some point, a GLP-1 was first in class before someone else, Novo or Lilly, was able to establish that this drug works in diabetes and obesity. So now if you're going after a GLP-1, you're actually going after usually a best in class. Right. So the class is the GLP-1, and then the first is like, it hasn't been tested before. Okay. We've all looked at probably the data. There's a lot of clustering in our industry. It's, there's and this is just a human psychological factor. It's easier to fail the same way everyone's failing. There's big corporate structures that you don't really kind of get as penalized sometimes failing because you can say, look, everyone's doing it. Everyone's going after GLP-1s.
Right. We think we have a unique angle on it, but
we will do
first.
Yeah, exactly. And so we think first in class is interesting, especially if you can use a data set to credentialize the target. And so, example, we just did a deal with a company called Immunomics. Fred Craves, the founding investor of Madrigal, was the CEO. And he had a 20,000 patient, 20-year longitudinal data set of immunology patients with kind of omics data, genomic, proteomic, transcriptomic data, and perturbations in humans. And they credentialized this first-in-class target, an anti-CD226 for immunology, but we're taking it likely in ulcerative colitis. And that is an example of a first-in-class, but maybe with genetic kind of evidence. The other kind of, just kind of give you flavors of
this is
things.
Very helpful to
We also think
understand.
about best-in-class, but maybe in a different indication. And so it'd be not first in class, right? So maybe examples like a TYK2, something like that. But can you take a TYK2 that might be brain penetrant, for example, and you take it into an indication that hasn't been in? There's some amount of de-risking because we know TYK2s generally work.
We know the target matters,
exactly.
And then you're just going to
that's another strategy.
Adjacent.
The other kind of really interesting, and this is more, we've had a few cases of this kind of working out quite well, is there are also like risk that our industry generally doesn't like. One is regulatory risk. And so we acquired this drug from Merck KGaA EMD Sereno. It grew cartilage. Specifically, it grows cartilage in the knee. And it was in 814 patients, including a 5-year, 549 patient study, 2-year treatment period, 3-year follow-up. Statistically grew cartilage. Everyone who took the highest dose didn't get a total knee replacement within a 5-year window. The challenge is, how do you show a drug delays or prevent something that takes, a long time to happen, maybe 5 to 10 years? Like you
without
take a
it
drug.
having to be a 10-year
Exactly.
trial.
Exactly. Yeah. And historically, that's been almost just financially infeasible or practically kind of run, right? To your point, 10-year study, you have to measure the TKR. And this is where some of our AI capabilities kind of play a role. Like we basically found that there was a MRI predictor of total knee replacement within kind of a 9-year window. And the folks that took the drug, it lowered the risk score, maybe just like lowering blood pressure reduces cardiovascular risk. And so now we're putting together like the world's biggest database of longitudinally followed knees to like 40,000 patients to basically validate that kind of surrogate predictor with the idea that, that could be used as a way to figure out the best path forward. And then there's a bunch we do in AI,
But
right?
by the way, that one, that one takes two to tango. You have to convince a regulatory body that surrogate marker is a valid one.
That's right.
How does one go about that?
Yeah. So the first thing is like, it has to be very scientifically rigorous. I think regulators do engage if you have really great data. And we found that to be the case. The maybe kind of psychological arb is like, we have this kind of framework. If you tell your friends about something and they think it's really like interesting, drug that grows cartilage in the knee, and then you talk to the KOLs and the researchers and the doctors who are experts and specialists in the space, and they think it's actually like really important, scientifically credible, but there's a regulatory challenge. Usually the arc of kind of justice, kind of, it bends towards where the need is, right? There's unmet need. There's a lot of kind of interest but I think it is, you have to have really compelling data. You have to have scientific rigor. And, there are a lot of, I think, situations where a company that was willing to maybe engage and not give up, a lot of kind of maybe, quote unquote legendary stories in our industry that have resulted in that. And we're quite excited about NeoA only because, as you know, about $30 billion of total knee replacements per year, and the economic burden's estimated around $300 billion from lost wages, lost economic activity. I know earlier, across the panels today, we're talking about how do you have drugs actually lower costs, but you can imagine something that prevents or delays total knee replacement, not just the healthcare costs, but the increased productivity.
Like a net benefit to society.
That's right.
Productivity.
That's right.
Okay, so let's say just to like do a quick recap. So I think you make the argument for why you have a reason to exist.
Yep.
The company has a reason to exist. Why we need a new pharma company that is sort of born today when we haven't seen a new one in decades. Why you think you have a right to win, right? In terms of picking and we'll I'm sure talk more about the technology aspect here. But what I want to take a minute to talk through is, what are the stakes? And what I mean by that is if, one could make the argument that the fact why we only have 40 to 60 approvals a year is because things have to get evaluated by the FDA.
Sure.
Right? You have to run a very thoughtful study to show that a drug is safe and that it's effective, and that goes through phase 1s and phase 2 and phase 3, generally speaking. And that all takes time, and you have to go out and find the patients to, that have the right inclusion criteria to enroll them in the trial, et cetera, et cetera. This is all a very sort of, a time intensive effort.
Right.
So in the best of scenarios where formation is extraordinarily successful, how many drugs are getting approved in a given year? Are we going from 50 to 500? Like what in your mind, in your biggest ambition for the company, how do you put a dent in the universe?
Yeah, the way we think about it is if you can, and this is kind of really reasonable, like run a trial for half the costs, maybe a fraction of the time, you enable twice as many shots, assuming probabilities kind of, maintain, all of a sudden you are doubling number of assets. We think we can go beyond that, right? With maybe the OA example, part of it is, can you create kind of the data sets that actually enable you to not to have to run as big of a trial? So all of a sudden it's not just, and maybe to kind of take a step back for a minute, one of the reasons we're able to run trials a lot cheaper and faster, in case it's interesting, maybe why clinical trials are so expensive.
Yeah, let's go through that because I think it's helpful. What is the technological?
Yeah, one of the big challenges is like, most biotechs and pharma companies today hire CROs. The CROs are bill per hour, cost plus business.
CRO stands for
contract research organization, and so the business model means that the more billable hours, the more revenue they earn, right? So other famous cost plus business models are like law firms, all the great law firms that I'm sure we use, and maybe contractors as well, right? So there is not for any other reason, just the financial incentives of cost plus business models usually means there's cost inflation over time. And so let's say you're running a phase 2 trial using 50 different trial sites. All those trial sites operate a little bit differently. Some might collect data using one system, at the site level, then they put it into an electronic data capture system. These things don't talk with each other. But for a CRO, that's positive because it's a bill per hour event, kind of to address that variability. So a big way we're able to run trials a lot faster and more cost effectively is we built our own tech-enabled CRO, where we built all the software technology to disintermediate a lot of those cost plus bill per hour activities. Just common times a question UCSF is probably used for a number of trials. Why do you have to do a site qualification visit before you do a site initiation visit? There's nothing from a regulatory perspective that means you have to do that. Every single visit is a billable event, right? There's, for those that in ClinOps, there's this risk-based monitoring versus interval-based monitoring. So your CRO usually has to visit each site to make sure that they're running the trial kind of appropriately. Logically, you probably would suggest we should visit the sites that have more issues more often versus visit every site the same number of times. Most of the time, there's maybe a bias towards having interval-based monitoring because that's guaranteed kind of revenue every single time. So that's even before layering in AI, is that if you can vertically integrate technology, people, processes in one, disintermediate those cost plus bill per hour activities. One of the jokes is my Series D legal fee was more expensive than my Series C, was more expensive than my Series B. I've used the same law firm every single time. They know the things, and in the valley,
it should be going the other way around.
It should be on the rent, but because now you're raising more money, you're running a bigger trial, you're incentivized to then bill more hours, right? So that's kind of one of the kind of challenges kind of today. We can kind of go a lot more into details and why hasn't there been a big CRO kind of created as well. But that's kind of one of the big challenges. Now you layer on AI, right? So I'll just kind of give you an example. Most of the knowledge work that we do today, AI systems can begin to kind of do work of entire teams. So it used to take our teams 2 months to put together a patient recruitment campaign. So we'd have physicians research the indications, segment the populations, put together all the IRB approved posters, advertisements, pre-screening forms, investigator brochures, all that kind of collateral, make sure it's IRB approved. Now it's minutes, with an AI system and one human in the loop, $8 per inference call. You think about all the other knowledge work. I need to research to understand where the white space is in atopic dermatitis now that Dupixent exists. We have custom versions of a deep research functionality that can find every single drug, in the pipeline, where they are, its mechanisms of action, differentiation, things that would just take a number of smart humans to kind of put together. We have tools to help us design studies. So, I'm running a study for OA. What is every single endpoint that was ever used in OA in the past 10 years, or what its outcomes? This stuff, becomes it's hard for a human to be as exhaustive, right?
Sure, of course.
And if you think about the headcount in a pharma company, a lot of it is in these kind of things. Even the search and evaluation process, right? How do you cover the whole universe of assets? We have a tool called Atlas. It's a homage to RA Capital's Atlas, but instead of 50 PhDs, it's deep research on every target indication pair. And that's where we see a lot of leverage, right? Understanding which targets should be matched to which indications. And I'm sure we've all seen biotechs that maybe got the right drug, but picked the wrong indication.
Right.
And hard again for a human to look at every single piece of evidence, be it genetic, publications, perturbation data, and beginning to systematize this. And that's another way we kind of get alpha is the coverage. There's a poster in China.
Right. So you see everything and you can digest everything.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say you could see and digest everything that helps you pick
Yeah.
More effectively, pick and point, right?
Yeah.
So you figure out where you want to take it.
Yeah.
Let's assume you put all the technology to bear, you get vertically integrated, so you're more efficient in your just in general processes and just standing up sites and that kind of thing. What's the net gain?
Yeah.
On an X percentage of time and a Y percentage of money saved, if you had to guess.
Yeah, you could probably do trials for half the cost, half the time.
Yeah. Okay, so
but without changing the
stakes.
design kind of parameters, because the cost plus of a CRO is 40% margin. The things that are harder to actually change are manufacturing costs. So that's a little bit more challenging because most, at least biotechs, don't have their own manufacturing costs. So you have to kind of pay that. But at least in the trial kind of components, maybe one heuristic is like for every $3, $1 goes to the site, like the site investigator fee, $2 goes to the CRO. Right. So there's a lot of kind of opportunities on the kind of like really kind of human capital intensive type of activities. If you begin to also think about study design kind of things, then you can get like maybe, really interesting kind of one order of magnitude kind of difference. But that requires some regulatory kind of things. Right. I mean, maybe, it's
that's
really
where it does take the two to tango.
It does.
Speak,
yeah.
right?
And I think you asked a really kind of great question. Like what will it take to actually go from, like 50 to 500, right? Because 50 to 100, I think is generally kind of doable. There is some like things that I know the FDA's been thinking a lot about, like how do we use AI to just like move the applications through kind of faster, and that could be a really kind of big thing. But I think like what we kind of think about the levers we have, right? One is like probability of success. The other is cost and speed. Cost and speed are easier to underwrite because I know if I build this thing, I can like do this thing this much faster. The hardest thing to actually like understand is what investments actually give you a higher probability of success. Yeah. And it's one of those things where like, as a computational biologist, it's actually one of the most fascinating intellectual kind of challenges. But the reason why we focused on something quote unquote more mundane of like cheaper, faster trials is I know if I do this, if I can run twice as many trials for the same cost and time as like another like pharma or biotech, like I will be able to kind of like go from 50 to 100.
Right. Your batting average doesn't necessarily have to be better. You'll just take more bats.
Yeah.
Bats.
There's a bunch of things that we know are associated with higher probability of success, right? Like genetic evidence. There are certain team members who seem like they have a better track record. But then there was kind of almost this philosophical question of like, how do you know you're actually better?
Right.
And you don't know till you can take enough shots post phase 2, right? Because that's the value inflection to know. And if your phase 2 average is 30%, statistically, you probably have to take at least 10, if not more, to know. And so one of the biggest challenges of, I think, the AI drug discovery space is one of the kind of conceits of like a discovery company is it has some sort of tool that ought to potentially give it a higher probability of success in the clinic. And when we look at the Gen 1 companies, like when their first trial doesn't work, and if they're a public company, they start to trade kind of close to cash, right? Because that platform value they were given was attributed to this belief that they should have a higher probability of success in the clinic.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe I'll kind of go into like why I don't think there's anything about AI today that should, and what needs to change in order to increase probability of success, because we think about that a lot in the company. But the thing I will tell to investors though is like, just because the first drug didn't work, you actually don't know whether they're better than average or worse than average, right? Because one shot for like, you probably need like 5, 10, arguably like 15, 20 shots to know, is their expected picking rate 50% versus 30%, right? Even if you hit, let's say 1 out of 2, I don't know whether I'm actually better. Right. I know if I run a trial and can do these processes cheaper, faster. I know if I'm, kind of acquiring drugs already discovered, my MOICs and IRRs, my multiple invested capital, my internal rate of return is higher because I don't have to wait to 2 to 5 years for the drug to get into clinic. I think AI discovery is one of the most exciting kind of things. It's only going to make this bottleneck worse because, if we can't already develop everything we discovered today, you layer in China and AI discovery, it's only going to create more kind of good drugs. So that's really why fundamentally we think we need to exist, because the bottleneck is drug development empirically, but also the markets reflect it. But on the discovery front, I think like, maybe just like quickly, all the great discovery innovations help you get to an answer faster, but there's nothing about discovery today yet that should improve your clinical probability of success. And by that, I mean, it might allow you to just zero shot something, find something that binds to something. But as you know, any great like drug discovery development team is never going to let a suboptimal candidate, make it into a clinic, right? They're all going to have the optimal, like a potency, ADME properties, all these kind of things. Yep. And so I think it's maybe kind of the a wrong expectation to assume today that drug discovery is going to help you have a higher probability of success in the clinic around kind of AI. It's going to help you get through each step a little bit faster. But our argument is like, there's already more good discovered drugs. So I'm not sure. And if you look at the patent life of a drug, the 20-year patent life, only 1 to 1.5 years is drug discovery related.
Mhm.
The majority,
The rest of it's development.
it's development.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are kind of just other kind of things.
Yeah, I think it's really intriguing to think of this as, where formation bio sits in the industry is if you assume good drugs exist out there, and you assume you can get real leverage from having technology applied to the long lead time step in the
Yeah.
process, right? The bottleneck.
Yeah.
And you hire great people and technology to help with picking and pointing these assets to where they should go.
Right.
You could really have a differentiated
Yeah.
outcome, if you will, in terms of being able to be more efficient in the industry.
And then the thing that we're most excited about, but will take the longest time to play out, and we're making a lot of bets here, is like, how do you increase the probability of success?
Right.
How do you predict what might work? We actually played around and used some of the state of the art kind of current AI models, and basically trained a model on all historical data and held out all the readouts, because the model information cutoff was like 2024, and then we looked at every readout since 2024. The area in the curve was like 0.72, so it's not bad. It's like industry average 30%. We don't give too much weight to it because fundamentally, I don't believe the data sets exist that you need in order to predict what's going to work before you run a trial. This is one of the most painful parts of my kind of graduate work, because we're trying to predict what's going to work before you run a trial. You think you're really good. You might think you're like 15 to 20% better, but your error rates are like your error bars are bigger than your perceived kind of advantage. And part of the kind of issue that I think, because going back to your question, like what would allow you to go from 50 to 500? I truly believe one day we might be able to predict what's going to work before you run a trial, but there's a lot of work there. We kind of have this framework, we call it kind of the uneven frontiers framework, kind of internally in the company. Like we should, as a company, especially in the era of AI, you should really kind of have a thesis for what predictions will happen first, what will happen last, and make sure your company strategy absorbs this as a net tailwind versus a headwind. So in our industry, there's 3 consequential predictions, we believe. One is prediction related to drug discovery. Second is predictions related to tox, so what might cause a tox issue in a human. And third is prediction related to clinical efficacy. So that holy grail of one day you don't need to run a trial and you'll know what works. Because if now your success rate is like 2, 3, 4x, that's how you get like the kind of leverage that we're talking about. We think it's going to happen in that order, partially because AI discovery, it's the data sets are cleaner. There's less variability. The way of basically measuring whether you're right, it's very clean. Like what binds to what, right? It's kind of chemistry. It's kind of biophysics. There's less human variability, and the ability to actually close the loop is a lot faster. And we're also seeing it empirically, right? Like all these amazing, companies like Isomorphic, Chai, like they're beginning to like show that kind of step. Tox is next, because we actually know what a tox signal looks like, right? We know what a liver tox signal looks like. And again, like animal studies, first in human, they're shorter. The reason why clinical prediction is going to take the longest is we don't know what most diseases getting better look like.
Yeah.
I don't know what the signal for Alzheimer's. Yeah. And so you kind of need, that's why you need like maybe like millions of patients, multi-omics, human perturbation to understand what does every disease kind of getting better look like. And until you have that kind of UK biobank on steroids, and by that I mean like maybe 5-10 million patients, genomic, proteomic, transcriptomic data, multiple time points, behavioral data, perturbation, so people taking various drugs, on drug, off drug, we won't be able to make those kind of predictions. And so that's kind of, I think, what's needed to believe you should have clinical probability of success. In absence of that, we're trying to use every single data set we can to give a little bit of an edge. But we underwrite conservatively, because in our model, when we create a new co, right, we provide all the capital and capabilities to get to value inflection. We typically own a good amount of the new co. We share uncapped equity with our partners, so it's kind of a win-win. And because of our advantages, even if we hit 3 out of 10 industry average, we create kind of pretty unique returns. Even if we only hit 1 out of 10 because cheaper, faster, we can kind of about 2x our capital.
Okay.
And that's, we kind of talk about that ways, because the right to earn the ability to take the next stage is we need to hit themes that win, sell after value inflection, medium-term co-commercialize at some point, and then the stakes are high because we do this and we're so kind of focused on doing things cheaper and faster because we believe there should be, a pharma company that can run trials cheaper and faster, do development faster, and ultimately lower the cost, expand access without compromising really kind of the margins, right? And that's where speed and cost really can make a delta.
Yeah. So let's maybe one place to end is zooming out to where the industry is. So speed and cost. You mentioned at the beginning that biotech is going through a market dislocation.
Yeah.
Right. Given some of the challenges and access to capital and all of those things. One could argue that the biotech industry is always not only is it going through a market dislocation, it may also be going through an industry relocation.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of activity happening in China now in a way that just didn't before.
Yeah.
And so, we use the simplistic heuristic that, Formation Bio could do trials at half the time and half the cost. Some people might say, is China already doing that? Is China already doing trials at half the time and half the cost as we do here in the United States? So this is more of a macro industry question for you and for all the folks that are working to discover and develop drugs. What do we need to do here to compete in this new world?
Yeah, I have maybe a very pointed take on that. Maybe just to set the base line, China's already doing better than that, right? It's anywhere from like when we looked at it, 1/2 of the cost to 1/7 of the cost to do the same activity in China. Part of it is the cost of healthcare, right? Trials are associated with the cost of healthcare. It's labor, it is population. They have a lot, bigger number of patients, right? So recruitment times, all that kind of stuff. There's a number of kind of advantages. China went from sub 5% to about 1/3 of the world's global clinical trial. Global assets like discovered.
Over the course of just a few years.
Yeah. Like sub 5% to similarly about 1/4 of the world's global clinical trial starts. And in certain areas like bispecific and ADCs, they're about like half of all the drug candidates in the pipeline, as you know. Having met and seen a lot of companies in China, there's this kind of like 996 work culture kind of on steroids. And so, I think like if it's about turning cranks, it actually might be pretty hard for the US. But I think there's a lot of things to be optimistic about the US. Like, we have amazing scientific researchers. We have the world's biggest historical like agencies that have all the all the submissions from previous trials. And I think the way that the US can win is making this more of an AI prediction problem. So that creating the data set we just talked about, number one, right? And then unlocking all the data sets from previous submissions. So one of the advantages of the US is we've had the most mature drug market. So we've had submissions from every single company for the longest time. And I know that leadership at the FDA is well on their way of doing this, a number of really kind of great initiatives. But how do we unlock data from a bunch of companies that failed, like biotechs that no longer exist, right? Because all that like preclinical tox data, that's the data set that might allow us then, there's a guidance around not needing animal studies anymore. Well, you have an AI model and it becomes like an AI prediction as a means of getting, through the regulations versus, you're turning cranks, which, I think China is like uniquely good at. They have a lot of scientists, they call them sea turtles, like people who trained at like Novartis and came back. The other kind of thing is there's this kind of topic about licensing, right? So one kind of way to think about it too, and this is probably less satisfactory, but a lot of US-based companies are licensing drugs from China into a US newco. Now they're a US asset
and develop them here.
Yeah, just like and the one thing is like the US won't allow Chinese data in of itself to be used for an approval. You need US data kind of appropriately. So you'll always need to run kind of trials in the US. We think over time the trend is going to be more and more assets are going to be coming from all the places across the globe. China is going to be a significant one, but AI is also going to create kind of more drugs. So that marketplace is going to increase. Our kind of view, it might commoditize drug discovery. To your point about what are some of the secular shifts in our industry, I think you're kind of beginning to see the beginnings of this where you're not getting as much credit for a discovered drug anymore.
Right.
I think compared to like 5-10 years ago. What universally gives a value inflection is a post-clinical readout.
It's a clinical trial readout, yes.
And so
there's no question.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so the net effect of all of this is if we get the technology right, if we get the regulation right, the access to data right, obviously the globalization aspects of this right,
Yeah.
the net effect is that hopefully this will result in patients getting access to many more drugs.
Yeah.
We go from 50 to 500.
Yeah. And we
at some
think
point.
like the thing, again, to underscore is like, we're not going to get more drugs if we don't solve the drug development bottleneck. And that's capital, but it's also the cost and time of drug development, and also the regulatory kind of processing to be faster. And I do think that the leadership at the FDA is like thinking extremely thoughtfully around this. Is like, how do we do warp speed, for every single company? How do we leverage AI to review submissions, kind of that those nuts and bolts, and how do we make that kind of a faster process? Otherwise, we're going to maintain that 2x increase, probably more of discovered drug candidates, but still the same kind of 50 or so per year. But to realize the AI, I think revolution, it is really going to be solving this drug development bottleneck first, and hopefully begin to assemble the data sets to make this just truly a prediction problem. That's going to take a little bit of time.
Well, we're looking forward to that time.